Chapter 10. Settlement of the town generally. More crown lands granted, local government organized. In the preceding chapters, we are told of the growth of the villages of White Creek and Cambridge, and how from the year 1761 through the Revolutionary War period, they came to be flourishing communities. In the meantime, there had been no idling with respect to inhabiting the interior of the town. Even the more hilly and isolated portions yielded to the forward push of the pioneers. Soon the town was crisscrossed by about a dozen crude byways, some no more than paths, over which the pioneers traveled by horseback or in their ox carts. In many a secluded nook in the White Creek Taconic Hills, the smoke could be seen lifting skyward from the great stone fireplaces of the log homes. Most of these early settlers were of Scotch-Irish stock, and they were perfectly at home in this hilly country, so similar in many ways to the highlands of their native land. The settlement of the town had been undertaken as early as 1650 to 60. Many had withdrawn to safer places downriver during the perilous French War period. Others had somehow braved it out. Of those who had left, some now returned and made a fresh start. Those who had remained, relieved of anxiety, redoubled their efforts. The Teoshoke village, which had been burned, was now rebuilt and took the new name Buskirk's Bridge. The Sand Croix settlement was rapidly reestablished. At Buskirk's, Martin Van Buskirk, the leading citizen at this time, built a tavern on the White Creek side, a stopping place which gained wide reputation. Several enterprises were established there at this time. Carpenters stored at a thriving business. The gristmill and sawmill were not idle, but the business interests have long since been transferred to the Rensselaer County side. The grants of Crown lands through 1761 have been described in preceding chapters. These were the Hoosick, Woolumsac, Van Corlear and Lake, and Cambridge. Now the remaining lands were being sought. In 1762, the Anaquasacoke grant was confirmed to Ryer Schermerhorn and Johannes Quackenbush. This lay in the north part of the town. In October of 1763, King George issued a proclamation that entitled officers and soldiers of the old French wars to draw parcels of the crown lands in America. The usual fees, which had long been the source of graft and corruption among the colonial authorities, were to be waived. A field officer might draw as many as 4,000 acres, a captain 3,000. Lieutenants and other subaltern commissioned officers were entitled to 2,000, but sergeants or corporals could only have 200, and privates a mere 50. The New York authorities parceled out the remaining wild lands in White Creek to the former military men by the name of Gregor, Grant, Campbell, Bain, Gordon, Small, Hepburn, and McVicker, who were served in the regiments of the Scottish Highlanders, drew their allotments. The Embury and Wilson grant in the northeast part of the town, confirmed during this time, does not appear to have been of military origin. Several of these military tracts overlapped grants which had been made by the New Hampshire authorities, which claimed that region also, and led eventually to a bitter controversy which involved some of the White Creek settlers. All this we shall come to shortly, but first more about those families who were moving on to the grants. Toward the 1770s, three brothers from Dutchess County, Aaron, John, and William Perry, bought 400 acres of the Van Corlear and Lake Patton. This they first held in common. For a time they occupied a log house which stood on the north side of the present James Harrington home. The old well was discovered several years ago by Morris Perry, beneath a stone wall fence not more than a dozen yards from the highway. The Perry homestead is the present home of Mr. and Mrs. Morris Perry, and was probably framed and raised by the brothers during their first 2 or 3 years there. When the property was divided, Aaron remained on the homestead, and William took the farm east of the log house and built his homestead a few rods north of the present Harrington house, the former James place. John left White Creek to live in Lansingburg. Lucy, come on. Aaron, who was a soldier in the Revolution and fought in the Battle of Bennington, married Anna Hoig, the daughter of Amos Hoig, an early settler of Pumpkin Hook. Their children were Israel B., who built the house where Wilford Robertson lives, Mary, who married Moses Bristol, Lydia, who married Anthony Hart, Isaac died young. Elizabeth settled in White Creek. Lucinda married and settled in Post Corners. Deborah became Mrs. Levi Bristol. Phoebe became Mrs. Peleg Fisher. Avrilla and Ruth, successive wives of James F. Telford. Patience died young. Angelina died young. William's children were Delavan, Philine, Mrs. Jonathan Fowler. Ovanda settled on the homestead. Juliet became Mrs. David Fisher. Cornelia and William I. Perry, son of Elihu, grandson of Aaron. John Younglove, for many years a judge at the Court of Common Pleas in Albany, and later in Washington counties, lived in the Perry neighborhood. Younglove incurred the animosity of James Parrott, a White Creek loyalist, when he, in his legal capacity, directed the confiscation of the latter's property, under the law whereby loyalists forfeited their holdings to the state. Parrott went to Canada, but in 1787 returned to White Creek to bring back his brother-in-law, John Lake, and a family. At this time, it is said, Parrott made a murderous attack on Younglove, entering his home and shooting him. The wound, however, was not fatal, and Younglove subsequently sold to Dr. Sanford Smith and moved to Jackson. Aaron and William Perry acquired the Younglove property from the Sanfords in 1802. Also, the Searles and Swift farms which adjoined it. Younglove's old home was burned during the Revolution, and the large farmhouse which stands here now was erected by Israel Brayton Perry in 1862. The old Dutch-style house which stood on the Searles part of this farm was taken down about this time. The Searles family have already been mentioned as among the earliest settlers to Sand Creek. The David Sprague family from Rhode Island came about 1771 and settled on a farm now owned by Mr. and Mrs. Ray Andrew. He sold to his brother-in-law, Joshua Gardner of Argyle, in 1794. Sprague was supervisor of Cambridge District in 1776, and later a magistrate. Joshua Gardner built the present brick house in 1813, a splendid example of the elegant trend in early American architecture. The Cottrell family, whose several homesteads are in the Van Ness Hill locality, were probably among those very early settlers who came in before the end of the French Wars. The present homes of Mr. and Mrs. Emery Clark and Mr. and Mrs. William Perry were the S.T. Cottrell and Nathaniel Cottrell homesteads. Austin Wells, the son of Edmund Wells, the pioneer of the Cambridge patent, settled in White Creek just south of Cowden's Checkered House Tavern. The Wells Mansion is one of White Creek's architectural treasures. Austin Wells was a Revolutionary soldier and served in the battles of Bennington and Oriskany. The wheelhouse, the Edmund Wells homestead, is not of White Creek, being on the west side of the turnpike in Henson, Cambridge, but part of that farm is in our town. The stocks and pillories of colonial times used for punishing wrongdoers were located across the road from this house on the White Creek side. The Preston family were very early settlers, by 1770 or even earlier, along the old road from Cambridge to White Creek. This old highway, of which scant trace remains today, forked to the south from the Ash Grove Road, about a mile east of Cambridge, surmounted the Barber Hills, past Lewis Hunt's present home, the old Hoig place, out his lane, crossing the Shaker Hollow Briggs Corners Road, and thence across fields belonging to Florence and Julia Niles. Then over the Tabor Brothers fields, crossing the Quaker Hill Road between Jones and Tabor's, through the fields now owned by Gordon Byers, and across the present rice farm, joining the present main road at James McCart's. Sorry, I had to take a break to get some bug spray and a hat. In a letter written by Miss Julia Niles to Jared Van Wagenen, Jr. on January 18, 1941, substantiating theirs as a Century Farm of New York, Miss Niles, a great-great-granddaughter of Levi Preston, writes of that family as follows. The farm here at Preston's Corners, Washington County, on which mother and father, Mrs. Herbert J. Niles, live, has been held in the family for over a century. Of course, I understand it dates back farther on the Preston side, but I haven't the records or dates at present. My great-great-great-grandfather, Levi Preston, lived here at the time of the Revolutionary War. While he was away at war, it has been told that his wife, Deliverance Mosier Preston, excuse me, with ear to the ground, could hear the cannon. Levi Preston didn't come home. He was burned in a church down the Hudson River, where he and others were driven by the enemy. Their daughter, Hannah Preston, married Elijah Slocum, and their daughter Mary married Jonathan Niles, who was my father's grandfather on his mother's side. Jonathan's brother Samuel was my father's grandfather on his father's side. On our farm there was quite a large Preston cemetery. My father remembers one stone that had a record on it. The name was Othniel Preston, died August 8, 1777. That stone has disappeared. Other stones haven't any names or records. Elder William Waite mentioned previously in connection with planting the Baptist church near White Creek Village in 1772, across from the Barker Schoolhouse, obtained a sizable tract of land about that time at what has since been called Waite's Corners, or Center White Creek. He gave the land for the cemetery and the Baptist church, which was then transferred there from its former situation in 1788. Hercules Rice from Worcester, Massachusetts, settled near Waite's Corners towards the close of the Revolution, and lived on a farm, although his trade was blacksmithing. He set up a sawmill between this place and Post Corners about 1790. About a half-mile south of the Corners was a grist mill run by James Hay about the same time as Rice's sawmill. These enterprises have long since been abandoned, but the rice mill site can be seen a few rods south of the highway as one travels towards White Creek Village. Zerah and Ezra Waite were storekeepers. Zerah lived next to the church, now the Moscrip residence. A tavern was kept on the opposite corner by Ishmael Gardner, and later by McConna Cornell. Next to this was Jonathan Hart's shoe shop. The post office was kept at W.P. Fowler's between the shoe shop and the hotel. Of these institutions, none remain today. The Fowler family were well represented in this part of town from earliest times. The homestead built by Abel Fowler is now the Dibble residence. About a mile west of Center White Creek is Post Corners, named for a town physician who resided there. The store was kept here for a short time, and there was a post office discontinued in 1866, the storekeeper, James Hay, being the postmaster. The Methodist church stood a few yards to the rear of the late Mr. Gooding's home. The Kenyon family settled in this vicinity. Once a very thriving section of town, but now a thing of the past, is Pumpkin Hook, the proper name for which is Pomponac, the site of a Pequot Indian village. This place had excellent water power facilities for the needs of the times, and a mill center of consequence sprang up there. There was a sawmill on a stream here before 1770, much resorted to by the pioneers. They could draw their saw logs to this mill and return by way of the Dunnell lime kiln for a barrel of plaster lime, then another stop at the Cornell triphammer mill for nails, and they were ready to put up a house. Pumpkin Hook had the Leonard Darby machine shop, where equipment for early Massachusetts cotton mills was manufactured. A woolen mill here was run by J. Gordon. Frank Crocker operated the distillery. At other shops, clocks and combs were manufactured. The old woolen mill was dismantled and the framework moved to Cambridge, where a store, since gone, was erected opposite the Brick Hotel. The chair factory at Pumpkin Hook was run by Mr. John Warren. A sketch of this appears on page 42. The names of persons living at Pumpkin Hook were more than a century ago are J.R. Warren, J. Madison, D.A. Lambert, W. Monroe, J. McCumber, S. Broadway, and W. Pierce. Thomas Ashton from Ballingram, Ireland, settled in 1769 in that part of White Creek since known as Ash Grove. He had been associated with the Wesleyan movement in Ireland and was greatly moved by the fervor of John Wesley. By an unusual coincidence, Philip Embury, the earliest exponent of Methodism in America, had a large grant of land in the north part of White Creek. The two men met and straightway planted a Methodist church in the Ashton neighborhood, the second such church in America. The first having been founded in New York City by the same Mr. Embury in 1766. The writer's great-great-grandfather, Samuel Draper, a Methodist circuit preacher, preached at Ash Grove in 1810 and 11, 1819 and 20, and 1822 and 24. Fairly nearly in the center of town is a neighborhood known as Shaker Hollow, William Ellis, who lived here, was of the New Lebanon Shaker settlement, and hence the name. The Russell family were well represented in this locality at an early date, and the Betsy Russell house, now Mr. and Mrs. Hall's home, was built toward the close of the Revolution. In the northeast part of the town is the Black Hole Hollow neighborhood, a secluded and picturesque locality, lying along a narrow valley of the North White Creek between the Taconic Hills. Its early settlers were of Scotch-Irish stock, the McKee, McCabe, Harrington, and Hodges families, among others. It is not to be doubted that these families had been identified in the old country with the Black Hull party, and that the name of the settlement was originally Black Hull Hollow, signifying that its inhabitants had been of that old Scottish order. By 1772, the outlying regions of Albany County had become so populous that the legislature felt pressed to provide a form of local government for the settlers. Accordingly, the county was broken up into districts, and Cambridge District, which included the present towns of White Creek, Jackson, and Cambridge, was organized. Shaftesbury and part of Arlington and Vermont were included. The eastern bounds of the town or county, even the state, were for many years indefinite, and until Vermont became a state in 1791, a contest had for many years existed between New Hampshire and New York over territorial rights. The first town meeting was held in May of 1773 at the home of Archibald McVicker, a half a mile east of White's Corners. White Creek was very aware of its identity as a community even at this early date, and agitated for separate status, but was held as part of Cambridge until 1816. At a special meeting of the inhabitants of White Creek, February 1st, 1775, it is recorded in the old records, voted to petition the assembly to be set off from Cambridge. The number of road districts during 1772 to 82 had increased from 13 to 28, and in the following 10 years to 48, an indication of the rapid growth of the town.